So learning about climate change, or really any sort of environmental pollution or degradation, can be really disheartening. The problems are so big. The industries that contribute to the problems are so powerful. The changes necessary to address the problems are so difficult. And the impacts of the problem on people and on the environment are just heartbreaking. In this semester, we've discussed a lot of truly terrible things. It's almost enough to make you want to just give up hope, curl up in bed, and never entertain a serious thought again. We've all been there, and probably will be again at some point. But before you lose all hope focusing on the problems, let's turn our attentions to some of the actions that are being taken towards solutions. At the East-West Center, I work with a program called the Pacific RISA, R-I-S-A. It's Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessments. Our job is to help integrate climate science information with the local needs and capacities. So global models say that thus and such pattern or change is expected to happen in this area of the world. So what does that mean exactly? What is the science saying in terms of what is going to happen to the people, to the areas, to the land, to the weather in that place? What should local leaders do about it? And are they capable of doing what they need to do? If not, what are they capable of doing? And are the leaders getting the type of information from the scientists that they need in order to make these decisions? Or should scientists be gathering data that would be more useful to these people and who apply it? These are some of the things that we look at. We try to integrate what is happening at national and global levels within the science, but then help people to apply it in local levels. So there are 11 RISAs in the country, all of whom work in some capacity with climate change issues. But all regions of the country are not at the same level of readiness to deal with climate change. The Pacific has, I'll say, the benefit of being one of the regions in the world that is first affected, and in some ways is going to be most affected by climate change. A lot of countries in our area, in our region, have already been dealing with extreme storms, extreme drought, coastal erosion, and salination of fresh water due to sea level rise, and other climate change issues excuse me, for a long time. It's unusual to meet someone in our region, someone who is from the Pacific, who has lived in the Pacific for a long time, who is not concerned with climate change. We're very aware of what is happening here, and so it's a little bit easier in order to implement some of these actions that we need to implement in order to address climate change. But other places in the world, in our country, must contend with people in politics and industry that are highly opposed to the idea of addressing climate change, of accepting that it exists, of doing anything about it. And so this is a reality of our world. The RISAs and other organizations in these areas are often prohibited from dealing directly with climate change. What I mean is that if they want local community members and decision makers to cooperate with them, they cannot talk about climate change. So what do we do if this topic, if this term is so contentious that it can't even be spoken aloud? Well, the answer is actually a lot easier than you might think. This is where we start focusing on what we call no regrets adaptations. These are actions that benefit the community or benefit the world in terms of climate change preparation, but they also are beneficial to the communities, to the world in other ways. So for example, if I make my factory more energy efficient, I'm lowering my carbon emissions, but I'm also making my factory more cost effective to run. Even if I don't think that there's any point in lowering carbon emissions, this is still a good choice because this saves money. It is beneficial to me. I do not have any regrets in making this change. Or as a community, we pass clean air law so that factories cannot emit as much. It lowers emissions, but it also makes our air healthier and it makes our community healthier. We have no regrets about passing this law. Even if it's somewhat expensive to implement, we still have benefit from making these changes that we can see and we can experience, in addition to whatever benefit for climate change. Another example, if we're on the coastline and our roads are very close to the sea, It's expensive to move the roads or to build a seawall or other adaptations, etc. But the sea is rising, and in 20 years or so, the roads are going to be flooding regularly, or damaged irreparably. So a lot of people don't believe that the sea level is rising, even though we see that this is the projection in the future. So they don't think that there's any reason to prepare our roads for the rising sea. Yeah? But even if we don't think that the sea is rising, we do believe that periodic hurricanes make these roads very expensive to maintain. So we invest in protecting them from hurricanes by moving our roads inland, building seawalls, whatever else. What we decide to do is to protect our roads from extreme weather events or from climate variability. It also happens to protect our roads from climate change. So this is no regrets. We're doing something that we know is going to be beneficial to our community, regardless of whether it also helps with climate change. By focusing on climate variability or extreme weather events, this is another strategy for addressing climate change in places where climate change is contentious. Climate change is something that happens over a lot of decades. It's very slow and very small in its incremental progression. Whereas climate variability are the changes that we see regularly over just a couple of years' time. We have ups and downs in extreme weather patterns, things like this. This is climate variability. This is the short-term changes that we see just in the regular course of our lives, of our weather patterns. In the Pacific, for example, our climate is variable according to the Pacific ENSO, E-N-S-O. It's the El Nino Southern Oscillation. So it's El Nino and La Nina seasonal weather patterns that we see. And also the PDO, it's the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, which is a longer-term weather shift with ups and downs that last about a decade, yeah? So these climate variabilities are actually much stronger in the short term than the long-term climate changes. And what I mean is, one year we have El Nino. Some countries are seeing really heavy rains, intense flooding, more hurricanes, etc. And then the next year we have La Nina year. Those same countries are now experiencing extreme drought, everything dries up and dies, we have very few hurricanes. And also, when we have La Nina seasons, in the last 2 years have been La Nina seasons. You may have heard about a lot of the droughts that are happening in the South Pacific. But in La Nina years, the winds are also so strong and consistently strong that they are literally pushing the ocean toward the west of the Pacific, so that island nations in the western Pacific experience high levels of sea level rise. Last year, the sea was, in some places, 10 inches higher than it had been the previous year. Now, when the weather shifts so to the other extreme of our climate variability, that water will recede and it's going to go back toward the eastern Pacific. 10 inches is a really huge change from one year to the next. Over a century with climate change, we're going to see about 1 meter of sea level rise, but in any given year, in any given decade, the sea level may be higher or lower due to our natural climate variability. Sometimes our weather patterns are going to exacerbate climate change, but sometimes they're going to reverse the trends entirely. And although we can predict what is going to be the general trend over a century, we can't say that in 2040 what type of season we are going to have. In the 2030s, we may see climate change exacerbated by our regional variability, so climate change just seems to be out of control and really bad in that decade. And then in the 2040s, it may be ameliorated from the opposite weather trends. And so climate change seems a lot better. Or it could be the other way around. But we can't tell in any given year or in any given decade in the future what seasonal variability we are going to be experiencing. So although climate change is going to be happening incrementally over time, the ups and downs are not going to make it just a straight line. So this is actually a very good reason to focus on not only preparing for the general trend of climate change, but also on preparing for the extreme weather events and climate variability. Another good reason is that no one is going to argue the need to prepare for the possibility of a hurricane in an area that could get hit by a hurricane. Preparing for extreme weather events oftentimes requires the same actions and preparations as preparedness for climate change. Climate change preparedness and disaster preparedness go hand in hand. Some regions that are more skeptical of climate change can still prepare for it by preparing for disasters. So a lot is being done in this arena because disasters are very expensive, and when we're not prepared for them, and so it is beneficial to us regardless to prepare for potential disasters. No regrets policies in climate variability. Yeah. So now I'm going to give a few examples of the types of changes that I think kind of typify the ways in which different sectors and different disciplines are involved in climate change mitigation, adaptation, and preparation. Our own Maxine Burkett, she's an associate professor of law at the University of Hawaii. She's been working with a group of other lawyers to develop international law that will protect countries whose land is projected to disappear or to become uninhabitable with climate change. Our current international law has precedent for governments who are in exile and could theoretically in the future return to their land, to their country in the future, given the right political conditions. But there is no current political precedent for governments whose land ceases to exist. Do they get to keep their UN seats? Do their maritime borders revert to international waters? Are their citizens still citizens if they have to live on some other country's land? There are literally no legal answers to these questions right now, but a group of international lawyers, including Maxine Burkett, are working on developing these international statutes that will protect these countries' legal rights on into the future of climate change. Another example is in Chicago. The city government wanted to begin to prepare for climate change within the city, but the science has not gotten to a point where it's specific enough to point future projects where a full and comprehensive plan could be implemented. So what the city has done, and I think this is a very shrewd and appropriate way to address all of this uncertainty that we have right now, is that they took just a couple of variables that we are seeing in projections, and they began preparing for those few variables without worrying about all of the details of what may or may not happen at any given time. So they were thinking it's going to get hotter and it's going to get wetter. Specifically, Chicago in the future, in 50 or 100 years, is going to look like southern Louisiana, which is a huge change, yeah? But the trees that can thrive now are not going to be able to survive in the future. And the drainage systems aren't going to be able to handle that high level of rain because they weren't built for that, yeah? Already we're seeing alleyways that flood whenever there's a big storm, which means no regrets adaptations are possible. We want to prepare for the heavier rains and floods that we may see in the future with climate change. So what the city did was they designed a specific special type of pavement that absorbs water without cracking. So the water just drains straight through into the pavement. It doesn't have to rely on washing out through the gutters. And it also, it expands and contracts, so it doesn't crumble into potholes when too much water is there, or when there are extremes in temperature, when it goes from very hot to very cold, because again we're going to see extremes in weather, not just general heating. But because it expands and contracts without breaking, this is beneficial because it'll be easier to maintain and repair. It does require special equipment in order to keep it clean so that it can still absorb the water, but the benefits are immediate. Already, when there's a heavy rain, the alleyways will not flood. People can see this benefit right away, and over time, we're going to see ongoing benefit as climate change changes the weather patterns. Chicago is also planting trees now that can survive now, but that are expected to be able to thrive in the future climate and weather that we'll have in 50 or 100 years. So trees that are currently planting that work in our weather now may not be able to survive into the future, so they're planting different greenery. Let's see, we also have citizens groups who are banding together to make changes of their own in their lives and in their communities without waiting for government or industries to take those first steps in preparing our world for climate change. One example of this is 350.org, which started as a student group. I think it was like 6 students who got together and said, what can we do about this? And now it's an international movement of people who are changing their lives to mitigate climate change through their own actions, and are also working to encourage governments to step up and make these changes as well in very broad ways. So all sorts of things are happening currently and ongoing, and it's consistently building. If you look through the readings this week, I want you to consider that these and other actions are not happening blindly. First of all, we have science behind it. People are relying on what projections we do have, even with whatever uncertainty we still have. Well, we're still looking at what are the general trends that we're going to see over time, and what are the extremes that we're going to see along the way. In addition, there are also people who are considering, or I should say a lot of these actions are considering the justice and fairness behind whatever climate adaptation policies that they are creating and implementing. So they're considering that different people are going to be differently vulnerable due to the region they live in, their gender, their class, their race, all of these things that we've been talking about this semester. People are considering this as we are moving forward with these actions that we are taking. The world is not just sitting back waiting for everything to collapse. A lot of people are working on this. So don't give up hope. And I look forward to the discussions this week in the forums. I think it's going to be really interesting, and I will see you online.